Hello and welcome to the Weekly Holler. I'm your host, Luke Boserman, the blogger behind the Weekly Holler, and this week I've got a great interview for you. One of my all-time favorite short stories is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I read it again this past October and found myself longing for more stories of that kind when I finished it. I'm not a big fan of horror, but as anyone who reads the Weekly Holler might guess, I am a big fan of spooky stories of the spine-tingling variety. So I hopped on Amazon looking for some more reading material, and I quickly discovered the Jason Crane series by Richard Gleaves. They revisit the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and they've delivered hours of the exact kind of spookiness that I enjoy. Richard was kind enough to agree to do an interview, and we had a great time discussing the legacy of Washington Irving, the folklore and history of Sleepy Hollow, Richard's philosophy on writing spooky stories that aren't horror, and the future of the Jason Crane series. That concludes this week's intro. We'll hop over to the interview now. It's audio only for those of you tuning in via Facebook Live. So sit back, relax, and get ready for some new legends of Sleepy Hollow. Welcome to the Weekly Holler, a heady brew of dark history, haunted folklore, and backwoods strangeness.
And she was an old lady when she was telling this story. Said we were sitting out there and it was dark, awful dark. No moon, no stars, pitch black. And out in the front yard, there rears up this white thing.
My guest today is Richard Gleaves, author of the Jason Crane series, which follow Jason Crane, the descendant of Ichabod Crane, in a modern reimagining of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. So far there are 3 books in the series: Rise, Headless, and Ride, Bridge of Bones, and General of the Dead, and I believe there's a 4th book in the works. So, Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me on.
So, I discovered the Jason Crane series this past Halloween, and they're just fantastic.
Thanks.
And, I've really been enjoying them. I'd love to hear the story how you came to write these novels. But first, I'm curious to know when you were first exposed to the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Do you recall?
Oh, yeah. Well, when I was a kid, of course, I knew the Disney cartoon. But in addition to the cartoon, there was also an album, a kid's album of the legend of Sleepy Hollow with Thurl Ravencroft, who was Tony the Tiger, singing the Headless Horseman song, and all kinds of songs that from the Disney cartoon, but on an album. So that was my little theater of the imagination. I used to sit and put that album on over and over and over and over again. And the flip side was Rip Van Winkle, so they were both Washington Irving tales. And so it's been part of my DNA, my love of spooky stuff and Halloween ever since I was little.
That's really cool. So I think, the average American doesn't really have an idea of how much the legacy of Washington Irving and the Dutch immigrants in colonial America, how their legacies have affected American pop culture, particularly in terms of the holidays.
Oh, yeah.
They really gave us things like Halloween as we know it, and Santa Claus. As you were writing these books, did you discover even more, or were you impressed with how much their legacy has really permeated American culture?
Well, yeah, there are really 2 almost forgotten things that come in with Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and that's the works of Washington Irving and the Dutch influence on the early days of the country. So those 2 things, those 2 elements are there's so much there to study. I mean, most people don't know that the Dutch colonized the island of Manhattan. It was Peter Minuit who got the island for the strings of wampum and the fur trade, and the Dutch were here first, and so much of what we take for granted. I mean, things like the word cookie. I mean, the word cookie comes from the Dutch. Coleslaw. Santa Claus is a Dutch legend. Washington Irving picked up the legend and ran with it. He gave us the sleigh. and all sorts of things that are uniquely part of Irving's addition to the story. As far as other holidays, none that I know of, but I will tell you that aside from Christmas, Halloween was almost made by Washington Irving. American Halloween, anyway. The autumnal scenery, the harvest mood, the spooky glades, and the whole colonial legend of Sleepy Hollow, ghost in the glen kind of spirit. I don't think that existed in our culture until Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Wow, that's quite a legacy that he has. Go ahead. Uh-huh.
No, I mean, and he loved Sleepy Hollow so much because he came up there as a kid, and he's buried in Sleepy Hollow, and his house was in Sleepy Hollow, and it's a place that he fell in love with, and I did too. And it's when you fall in love with a place and you write about it, it's a special thing.
Did you ever visit Sleepy Hollow as a child?
Never. I grew up in Texas, and when I was I started out as a playwright and composer, and I moved up to New York to write for theater, and I had successes, hits and misses, but I was getting to hit my 40s, and one thing that I noticed as I was getting older that I wasn't doing Halloween at all. Every Halloween would come around, and it would be I had no plans. I didn't answer the door. I'd go to a restaurant and read a book or something, and it really annoyed me because it was getting boring. And so I'm in New York, and only about a half an hour north is the Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. And I was like, I always loved The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I remember my album when I was a kid. That was Halloween to me, so I promised myself that I would go and make a Halloween trip out of it. And that was my first trip to Sleepy Hollow. And it was like the rebirth of my Halloween spirit at the same time as it birthed the book series.
So when you went up there and visited it for the first time, were you going up there with the intent of researching a book, or
no,
were you just going for fun?
Up there. I was going as a tourist and as an old fart who wanted to get into the mood of Halloween again. One of the things they do,
spirit, huh?
One of the things they do up in Sleepy Hollow, I mean, they have haunted houses, and they have the great jack-o'-lantern blaze up at Croton, which is Van Cortlandt Manor is redone for Halloween with thousands of pumpkins all over the grounds. And so there's so many, besides the beautiful scenery, Westchester in the fall, it's evocative. It's got everything that you want Halloween to have, plus they have all these events. So I was just going as a tourist. I thought I would go for 4 or 5 days. I did a corn maze, stuff. But it was Sleepy Hollow that stayed with me.
So I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this maybe didn't realize that Sleepy Hollow is a real place.
Yeah.
I think more people are familiar with the legend than there are people that are familiar with the actual location. What's the history of Sleepy Hollow?
Well, the Dutch, as I say, settled Manhattan, and one of the things that happened during the Dutch period of the colonies was they spread northward in a series of manors there were powerful men who took swaths of land north for their farms. And they owned the land, they rented the land out to tenant farmers. And one of these was Frederick Phillips. Frederick Phillips, he built the bridge from Manhattan to Bronx over the Spuyten Devil Creek. He kept the King's Bridge, and he had this vast stretch of land that was pretty much all of Westchester County. And Frederick Phillips took over, he built his mills in a spot that the Dutch called the Sleeper's Port. The river is the Pocantico, which is the Indian name for it. And the Pocantico comes down Westchester County and empties out into the Hudson. And Frederick Phillips built his mill at the place where the Pocantico goes into the Hudson. And once the mill dam was built, the water got sluggish. And so that bay just south of beyond his mill dam, that little bay became known as the Sleepy Haven, the Sleeper's Port, the Sleepy Hollow. And that's where the name came, Die Slappershaven in Dutch. And so originally it was just that port that was called the Sleepy Hollow. And then the land around was known as the Phillips Mills. And the tenant farmers that he rented the land out, they put together their own little, shops and taverns and things around one little loop of road and one little dock and one little, main market road, and that was Tarrytown. And that was the colonial Tarrytown was pretty much one tavern, one church, one road, a dock, a few merchants, not very much there. But that's Ichabod's Tarrytown. If you're looking for it, you can look on a map of modern Tarrytown, and you can see Broadway, which is the main road, and Main and Franklin make a loop. And if you pick out that loop, that was the only road in Tarrytown, and it went down to the docks and back up. So there's the crux of it. Washington Irving, his Sleepy Hollow, he moved the name to refer to the valley that the Pocantico comes through on its way down to the mills. And that valley became known as the Sleepy Hollow, where Ichabod's Bridge goes over the Pocantico and all of that stuff. That's where that comes in.
Okay. So, obviously, you were talking about going to Sleepy Hollow to kind of, revive your own Halloween spirit. And obviously that area instilled that kind of spirit and feeling in Washington Irving when he discovered it. Did you feel like when you went there that outside of, obviously the celebrations of the Sleepy Hollow legend and everything that you kind of could feel maybe some of the same things that Irving felt when he discovered that area and its landscape?
It sounds lame, but there is a kind of a magic to the place, and it's kind of a combination of the town is on kind of a slope overlooking the Hudson. So pretty much wherever you are in town, you can see the water, you can see the Hudson going by, and then to the east it goes to a crest that's all woods. It's the Rockefellers bought all the land, so the woods are still there, all the ancient woods that Irving would have known. So you've got the woods up above, the water down below, and you're just on this little slope. And the leaves kick up, the trees turn, it's red and gold and scarlet, and you can see the highlands across the Hudson. It's really a magical place. And what Irving loved, he came up when he was a kid because there were all these yellow fever epidemics down in New York, and his parents wanted to keep him safe from them, so they sent him north to Westchester County. And so he stayed in Sleepy Hollow and played in the woods and listened to the superstitious old Dutch wives tell their tales. And he fell in love with, you take the gorgeous scenery, but then you have this peculiarly superstitious people that lived there, because even though the American Revolution had happened and everything, ethnically, Westchester was still very Dutch. And so Irving found them fascinating and loved their tales. And so this is where his lifelong love of the Dutch, comes in. I'll give you a couple of things about the Dutch here.
Yeah.
First of all, you look at the Dutch and as they are in Europe. They're always been known for their tolerance, etc. So when the Dutch founded Manhattan, they got along with everybody, and it became a big international port. And if we're looking at America as a place that's pluralist and tolerant and has an immigrant history or whatever, the culture of that came from the Dutch. And the Dutch superstitions, I think, is because the Netherlands are very flat. And if you live in the Netherlands, you can see your neighbor coming miles and miles down the road. Now take those people and take them to Westchester County with these forests and the Indians in the woods and stuff. They freaked out. They didn't agree with it. So that's why they jumped at shadows every 5 seconds, because they were not used to that.
They were used to seeing things coming.
Exactly. They were not used to things jumping out of the woods at them, and they were scared. And I think that's an explanation for why the American Dutch are so much more spooky minded.
That's a really great insight. I mean, I can totally see them. Just
we don't like this place.
Yeah. I think I saw something on the way home tonight.
Ghosts everywhere. They're out to get me. And so for me, I get to Sleepy Hollow, and there's this mood. There's this kind of a melancholy harvest mood to it in October, and the wind blows. It's just a little chill. It's just exactly what you think Halloween should be. And you just feel like you want to wander the streets and whisper to unseen presences. There's just something about it.
That's cool. I really need to get up there and explore it for myself. That's definitely on the bucket list.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe it's objective. Maybe everyone would feel that way. That's certainly how I felt when I went up there.
Yeah.
Just a little thrill. Just a little
thrill in the air. That's a great way to have the idea for a series of books. Get that inspiration right out of the air you're breathing.
Oh yeah.
So you were mentioning some of the the folk tales and the superstitions that Washington Irving would have encountered when he went to Sleepy Hollow. In your research for the books, did you run across any tales or things that would have been the same material that he was running into?
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. Like the very first folktale of Sleepy Hollow is that Frederick Phillips, when he built the mill kept failing. The dam kept breaking. And one of his slaves told him that the mill would never be profitable, that the dam would always break unless they built a church. And so right across from Phillips Manor, which is still there, it's like a historical preserved box. The mills are still there. And they figure very large in my books, too. Right across the street from the mills, right across Broadway, on a little hill is the Old Dutch Church. And the church was built to bless the mill dam. One of the very first and earliest folk tales of the region. And it's an extraordinarily, it captures the imagination. This little Dutch church made out of field stones, because they just went and dug them out of the ground and built it. And it's one of the oldest churches in America. And it's right there next to the Pocantico, and around it is the burying ground, the old Dutch burying ground. All these tilted headstones and, broken headstones. You think of like the most evocative cemetery you can think of. It's there. Iron fence and everything else. And, you look at like the headstones of the burying ground, and you have these old folk art skulls and crossbones. In these old poems, corruption, earth, and worms shall but refine my flesh till my triumphant spirit comes to put it on afresh. You wander around these graves, and it is at once creepy, plus it's got that beauty, that simplicity of folklore. And I became fascinated by the entire region. And I was standing in that cemetery, looking at the headstones. And I remembered that when I was when I was a teenager, my grandmother and I traveled across the country and made grave rubbings in old cemeteries like that. And this was the kernel of wanting to write the story. So I was like, okay, maybe I could write a story about a kid doing grave rubbings that comes to Sleepy Hollow. Well, why would he come to Sleepy Hollow? He's the last descendant of Ichabod Crane. And then the wheels were turning. And as over 3 years of writing these 3 enormous novels, I mean, all these stories. Washington Irving would have known, like the Lady of Raven Rock, which is a story about a woman who died in snowfall looking for her lover, and she is there at Raven's Rock, and her spirit cries out, "My beloved, where are you?" That's one he would know.
Yeah.
He would know the story of Mother Hulda, who was the Witch of the Woods, and she was an old German witch who supposedly lived in the woods of Sleepy Hollow around a stone called Spook Rock, which is a old piece of stone on the hillside that the Indians loved and used it as their charter stone. There's all these little things, these little tendrils, and slowly, as I started working on the book, it was finding all these little things that connected to American history and this real modern place and Washington Irving and the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it just became a joy to just kind of pull all these influences together into one story.
They certainly make an enjoyable read. I can vouch for that. I've really been enjoying them. Now, from what I understand, every location in your books, aside from like the characters' homes, is a real place, like even down to trees and rocks and street names and restaurants that you mentioned. So, as I was reading this about your books, one of my favorite things to do is to explore a place that really has, fascinating regional history and folk tales and things like that. So I can only imagine that the research process and the explorations that you made of the town were just a ton of fun. Yeah. Do you have any highlights that stand out in your mind from that research process?
This is 3 years of my life. So, there's all kinds of highlights. I mean, it would be hard to narrow it down. Okay, so I go back to New York, I start typing, and as I'm working and I'm telling this story, I go, I really want to talk about the way the headstones tilt in this particular way, or where I want it to match the layout of the cemetery or the layout of the mills, or I want to use these street names, and all these real things started coming into me because what I realized was that when Washington Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he was writing about a real place that he actually knew. So when you go and you look at Ichabod has singing lessons, gives singing lessons to Katrina. That's at the Old Dutch Church. That's at the church that I just was talking about. When Brom Bones has his dog howl under the window to embarrass Ichabod, that's outside the window of the Old Dutch Church. All these things that you read in this short story that we all think we know so well, you start digging, you find references to the mills, you start finding references to actual real things. So in that spirit, I said, well, I want my Sleepy Hollow to do what Washington Irving's did, and I wanted to match my Sleepy Hollow. So the challenge, it's much bigger now, but the challenge was to, take a town that's, streetlights and, McDonald's and everything else that's there and turn it into Sleepy Hollow again. So I went up there time and time again. I just got a rent car, and every couple of months I went up with a tape recorder and walked the place. I made friends with the head of the cemetery, and he gave me permission to go into the cemetery at night. And so there's a large stretch of story in book 3 that was written because I was just walking in the cemetery at 2-3 o'clock in the morning with the tape recorder, just kind of dictating it and making it up and telling myself a ghost story. And a lot of the books were written like that. I went out to the woods and found what I decided were the foundations of Ichabod's Bridge, and I wrote about them, as if they were there. I went on tours and down into the aqueducts and visited all the historic locations, and I went to the Historic Society and went looking for, I decided where the barber shop had to be in colonial Tarrytown, and I went to the Historic Society and got out the map, and lo and behold, that's where the barber shop was.
Really?
Yeah, it was like channeling this huge. There were so many moments of serendipity and so many just wonderful surprises as I was working on the books. I can't. It's almost like this thing just kind of came into my life. It took me for a wonderful ride and, dropped me again. It was unrepeatable.
That sounds like a wonderful experience. Now, in any of that walking around in the graveyard after dark and making up stories, did you give yourself a good case of the creeps?
Oh yeah, I had to. To give myself the creeps on purpose. And there's a lot of things. Maybe it's why I hadn't written a novel before these, but I find that for me, the fun of writing fiction is to take a real place and tell a fake story in it. So it becomes like a celebration of some place that I like, and an imagination. It becomes the stage. The real place becomes the stage of the story. And then if I see a bent lamppost or something, I go, how did that lamppost get bent? Oh, I got to have a scene that lamppost gets bent. There are things that are, features of Sleepy Hollow, the lighthouse, or, particular things that are bent or busted that I have my characters bend or bust. So it looks like the town was used by Jason Crane and his friends. It's a joy. And another part of it was learning a place down to its roots. I'm lucky that Sleepy Hollow is small enough that, one person can really dig up all its secrets. If I was dealing with New York or some major city, it's a lifetime's work. But Sleepy Hollow is just one little, couple of square miles of Westchester. And the population was small enough that I can know the Beekmans and the Wildies and the Martlings and the Requas, and I can know all these personalities and their genealogies and all the real people and all the real street names.
That is really cool. I enjoy that kind of exploration myself. I really like how you pointed out there, that in this fiction that you've written, that the place is the stage. I think that's what makes folklore at least enjoyable for me, is you can hear the story and then go see the place that it's told about, or the rock or the river or the tree, and there's just something about that, the kind of meeting of real history, real locations, and these supernatural stories that makes
you
them
can
special.
You can see someone, he's finished his work for the day. He's cutting home through the woods, and it's twilight, and he sees a huge rock, and from a particular angle, it looks like it's got a man's face. And that rock was there 50 million years before he came and noticed that it looked like a man's face, and it'll be there 50 million years later unless somebody digs it up. But it's there for me, it's there for him, and he tells a story about the rock with the face on it. I can go and stand in the same spot that guy did and see the same effect. And there's stories like that all over America, all over the world, that are, I call it, like ghost history. There's real history, which is, books, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and, King this and King that. And then there's ghost history, which is, verbal, which is, folklore, which is the things that are passed around in connections with little places and lives that are otherwise forgotten. That old woman that used to live on the hill, she sat at her spinning wheel for her entire life and keeled over and died, and her ghost still haunts it. Well, if not for that ghost story, we wouldn't remember that old woman. That's her way of being included in history. Those two men that were building that bridge, and they fell off it and they died. If not for that story, we don't, that bridge is haunted because the two men that died building it. We wouldn't remember those two men if not for the ghost story.
Yeah, oftentimes the rural America or the rural places of the world and the working classes, this kind of lore is the only history that's really left, from them. A lot of times the official histories that we have come from the more developed areas. So these stories are a great way to connect with these small places like you're describing, these little places like Sleepy Hollow, the small towns that, the majority of America is from.
Yeah, I mean, every small town you're going to have some either a ghost story or, if it's a really old place, you'll get Sleepy Hollow has the luxury of having, 400 years of history around it. So it's peculiarly, complicated in its ghost lore and stuff. But, I mean, you go to Europe, damn, you can't, take a 20-foot walk without, running someplace that's got a ghost story attached to it. And that's a good thing. I mean, That's oral history. It's, ghost stories. Even if you're going to make up a ghost story, you're going to make up a ghost story from scratch. What is a ghost story? There's some strange presence that you can't explain. Just like that traffic sign, with the man's name on it. You don't know, why is that road named what it is? It's a presence that is in our, where did it come from? And there's a ghost in your house. Where did she come from? What does she want? And every ghost story is like peeling back the layers to uncover the history and why she's there and what is her unfinished business. And learning the history of a place is like you take a street name and why is that street name there? And you uncover the layers and you find out, who is it commemorating? Who named it? Whose farm was on that corner? History and ghost stories are part and parcel. I think they're linked to each other.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue into to something else I was wanting to talk about.
Uh-huh.
I think one of the reasons that I really enjoy the Jason Crane series is they're really spooky in the same way that the original Legend of Sleepy Hollow is spooky. And by that I mean there's something different about those kind of stories in the modern horror genre, which is what most people think of when they think of ghosts and, haunted, stories and things like that. But I'd say that the Jason Crane series is more gothic, in the same vein as like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, these campfire ghost stories that you were talking about. It's very like moody and atmospheric. What do you think differentiates these kinds of stories from horror as it's commonly thought of nowadays?
Well, if you're going to tell a spooky story, okay, let's just scale back. Why do we like spooky stories? Because it's like becoming a kid again. When you're a kid, you're scared of the dark, and that means you're a little mammal in the dark, scared of predators. Your ears are really big, your eyes are really wide, and, something's behind the door, something's under the bed, that feeling of, the unknown. Now, spooky stories are about reverting you to that childhood state, kind of as the writer taking the reader by the hand and saying it's okay to be a kid. That there's something mysterious, and I'm going to convince you. I'm going to make it real for you that you don't know everything that you know as an adult. That there's something mysterious just around the corner or in the attic, or what was that sound? To bring you to that place, I think is a higher form of art, because it is leading you back to childhood to create that atmosphere that we loved as kids. Halloween with. You got your costume and the night and the wind's just blowing and everybody's dressed as a monster. And how great is that? Now, that's one way to tell spooky stories. And that's my way. That's the way I prefer. And I think it's a better way, to be honest. Now, the other way is not to bring the reader from being an adult back to being a child, but let him stay an adult, but then scare him by upping the stimulus. Not what's in the closet or a little creak or whatever, but, oh my God, there's a serial killer with a knife and he's coming at you,
Yeah.
It's upping the stimulus instead of, regressing the reader. You know what I'm saying? So a horror story is to make you feel like a kid by giving you things that you have legitimate reason to be scared of as an adult. So horror is, oh my God, there's an alien bursting out of my chest. Oh my God, there's a guy with a knife. Oh my God, I'm locked in a cage and he's going to pull out my fingernails unless I,
Yeah.
That's horror, And it's to get you scared. But the problem is that, it's like a addict. It's like a drug. It's like heroin or whatever. It's like
you get desensitized.
So it's got to be you go from Final Destination to Human Centipede or whatever is going to push your buttons to get you to that state. And I think it's healthier to say I don't want to have such great horror that it's going to scar me. I want to take myself back to that state of being a kid. So. With the Jason Crane series, what I love is putting my characters on long walks in lonely cemeteries and, or sending them down into dark tunnels and finding, skulls and, it's scarier to see the torture racks on the handcuffs, the rusty handcuffs dangling from a stone wall is scarier in a spooky way than, actually seeing the serial killer. It's what you don't see. It's the implications of what you're thinking. And I think spooky for me, I mean, there's not enough of it around Halloween. You go to these places that have haunted house, haunted hayrides, whatever. And what do you get? You get these plastic places with plastic eyeballs and blood and severed hands and stuff, and it's just gross. It's not spooky at all.
It's kind of reenactments of 80s slasher movies.
Yeah. My philosophy of how you do it is how you up the stimulus to make an adult feel like a kid. And that's what I want to do. I want to make an adult feel, not by dumbing it down, not by, telling, this is not, little Disney, thing. I mean, these are books in which, people die fairly violently, but, they're not horror books. You know what I'm saying? And the way you do that with an adult, let me put it this way. When you're a kid and you're that little mammal sitting there with your ears wide and your eyes open, what is that? You are open to every little sound and every little creak. Now, for the purposes of fiction and the technique of fiction, the way to do that to an adult and to put an adult there is to make the adult very aware of the colors of language. And how the way that you make a book for an adult that brings them to that place is you lead them through evocative language and color. You give them mood and atmosphere. This is why a Gothic novel, Poe, Irving, this is why they're so rich in language. Look at Anne Rice and her vampire books, which are not horror but are spooky. Mayfair Witches, she writes spooky the way I write spooky, but how does she do it? And how do I do it? Is that to heighten the language, so that as you're reading, you feel like your eyes are bigger than they ordinarily would be, or your ears are larger than they ordinarily would be. You're taking in more because the language is bringing you to that place, and that's a way to write a book that's not that is adult and sophisticated, etc., but that makes you feel like you're reading like a kid. That's my theory, anyway.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. As I think about Poe's writing, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, I think that heightened language kind of has the same effect as like your heightened senses, as a child when you're scared, like you're talking about,
Allan Poe's very big on that whole heightened senses thing. You look at Fall of the House of Usher, and the language is all about, getting these strange rhythms and these strange verbal effects that make you feel like you're the Usher character who is hypersensitive to sound and taste and everything else. The person, the telltale heart. Your ears are so big that you can hear the heart beating under the floorboards, and it's driving you mad. That's very big in Poe, and that's all heightened. Is creating the illusion of heightened senses through prose.
Yeah, and I'd say the same thing. You see it in. I'm thinking of young Goodman Brown, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Mm-hmm. When you're walking through the woods with young Goodman Brown, you hear the creaking trees, and you just the same way you do when you're on edge, as a kid, because the scare seems realer,
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up Hawthorne because, in the course of making the Jason books, I found that the universe of the books grew beyond just Sleepy Hollow. It gave me a world to play in, and so the series is continuing into book 4 in Salem. And what am I researching and integrating into book 4 is Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so that kind of, witches and haunted houses, but when you're talking about the actual history of the witch trials, the actual house that Nathaniel Hawthorne had a personal connection with through, I believe, his cousin, the building of the house is connected to the witch trials. There's all these things that suddenly you have another whole rich vein of Gothic history to play with, and I'm looking forward to bringing the Jason characters into that world as well.
Yeah, what a perfect way to expand the Sleepy Hollow universe over into Salem. They're made for each other.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I've already got like 3 years of notes because when I got bored of Sleepy Hollow, I took the train up to Salem and walked around for a day or two.
Now, has Salem struck you with that same kind of feel in the air that Sleepy Hollow did?
I have to say it hasn't, because there's something different about Salem. Salem as a town it's got an essential contrast, because you look at the history. Salem is well known for what is essentially a terrible tragedy. I mean, Sleepy Hollow is well known for what is essentially a fun story about a lanky schoolteacher and a thrown pumpkin. But Salem is known for, Puritans who became hysterical and accused their neighbors of witchcraft and hanged them. It's not really the same story if you approach it that way. And so, it's
much more grim.
Yeah, but then you look at how does Salem celebrate Halloween or do these things. It's a carnival town. This is fried dough and Ferris wheels. And so Salem for me is this huge contrast of it's like calliope music in a graveyard. It is at once a carny town with lots of hucksters trying to get your buck by taking you through Count Orlok's Nightmare Gallery with the wax figures of all the horror movie monsters. And that's right across the street from the old burying point where the witch judges are buried. And that's real tragic history on one hand, and then this strange carny environment on the other. And then you have all the pagan Wiccan crystal, you have the shops,
kind of
all their
New Age.
Yeah, New Age stuff on top of it. So it's very different from Sleepy Hollow, because Sleepy Hollow is, it's still just a little New York town with a creepy history. Salem is a tourist attraction, and it capitalizes on what's essentially a tragedy by turning it into a bazaar. And there's something that I'm still kind of struggling with how to fall in love with Salem in the same way, because I haven't reconciled that for myself yet.
Thanks again, Richard. And I just want to plug the books again here at the end for anybody listening to this. It's Rise Headless and Ride, Bridge of Bones, and General of the Dead. And the best part is they're not short like most spooky tales. You get hours and hours of spookiness out of these.
Yeah, they're huge books. I mean,
yeah, and the audiobooks are wonderful.
The audiobooks are my favorite way. If you're going to if you're going to get the books, Eric Michael Sommerer, I found him is just like, it was a miracle, and he is just the perfect narrator, and I can't be happier with the audiobooks. They're what I would like people to hear first.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. You can find Richard's books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to check out theweeklyholler.com for more stories.